Good afternoon, Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek, Thomas Jefferson scholar and author of 24 books on Jefferson. And today I'm going to talk to you about a topic I think that has been greatly misunderstood, in which scholars have misrepresented Jefferson's views. Jefferson and religion, specifically Thomas Jefferson and the afterlife. Most scholars argue that Jefferson believed in some sort of afterlife because there are numerous sort of oblique references by Jefferson to the afterlife in some of his writings, and I'll explain that in a bit. Let me give you just a small sampling from literature. Charles Sanford, in The Religious Life of Thomas Jefferson, which is a fairly bad book, writes Jefferson was influenced by Adams' arguments about spirits, the find room in belief in immortality among the wondrous attributes of certain forms of matter. Elsewhere, he says, matter had many mysterious properties such as magnetism, gravity, and the power of the brain to think. Why not immortality of the soul for human beings? Now, really bad argument because we find that matter has many special properties, so why can't soul? Is he assuming soul to be a certain sort of matter, which Jefferson does, by the way? Why can't soul be immortal? Begs the question here. It doesn't go to any of Jefferson's writings. E.S. Gausted, in an essay titled Religion, says the immortality of the soul was for Jefferson a guarantor of morality. So Jefferson smuggles in immortality of the soul for Gausted just to get people to behave morally. It's not it's a sort of pragmatic argument, which is not a guarantee that there is immortality of the soul, but merely just saying Jefferson at least endorsed, championed immortality of the soul to keep people in line. He writes, well, he says, justice and goodness must ultimately prevail, else this is not a moral universe. Eugene Sheridan, who writes quite intelligently in a long essay on Thomas Jefferson religion in the reconstruction of Jefferson's Bibles, he says that Jefferson entertained doubts concerning an afterlife, but on the whole, hope triumphed over despair. Now, of course, this is not an argument that, again, he's not combing Jefferson's views on the topic and coming up with a reasoned argument, but he just said Jefferson was a hopeful person, so he must have believed in life after death. Paul Conkin says Jefferson was always confident of life after death. Tells us really nothing other than just makes the assertion. John Ragasta on Thomas Jefferson's Religion and Religious Liberty argues that Jefferson's insistence, Pace Calvin, that one is to be judged by one's deeds, suggests some sort of belief in the afterlife. Not very a very interesting claim. Now, one of the things to say when you look at, people always cite, well, I think his second inaugural address and other writings to people, he talks about, I'll see you in the afterlife, I'll see you in the hereafter, things like that. Jefferson had an uncanny capacity for writing for people in language that they'd understand. And I note that when he talks about the afterlife in certain writings, he just mentions it briefly and suggests, like the Abigail Adams, he says, we'll meet in the afterlife, right? There's no discussion of an afterlife. It's just a passing comment. So he provides no justification for that view, and he gives no full discussion to it. And that needs to be noted. Now, of course, that's not an argument against an afterlife. I will just provide that, but I just stating for the nonce that he never opts for lapses into serious discussion of the topic of afterlife in these references, right? Now, did Jefferson believe in any kind of soul or transmigration of souls? He writes to Reverend Isaac Story, who's written a letter to him about transmigration of souls, sort of Platonic view here. And Jefferson says, the laws of nature have withheld from us the means of physical knowledge of the country of spirits, right? He doesn't want to get into that. He's telling Story. I have nothing to say on the subject. Don't bother me on this. I don't have it. This is the realm of flimsy metaphysics. I don't have anything to say. To John Adams in 1814, Jefferson writes, talks about Plato. Plato is peculiarly appealed to as an advocate of the immortality of soul, and yet I will venture to say that were there no better arguments than his in proof of it, not a man in the world would believe it. Of course, this is not an argument against the immortality of soul. This is basically saying that if one were to appeal to Plato's arguments for immortality of soul and only to Plato's arguments, we wouldn't get too far. All right. Now, the first thing to note is that if Jefferson believes in immortality of soul, it has to be some sort of material immortality, because he's an out and out, without question, he's an out and out materialist, right? So the question is whether there is, as Carl Richards would say, if there's going to be immortality, it'd have to be whether the soul, as the body decays, whether there could be a sort of instauration of matter, a sort of rebuilding up of matter, so that the person could exist again in some sense in an afterlife. And that, and that's sensible. It's a sensible claim by Carl Richards. But I don't think Jefferson believed anything like that. Now, concerning his materialism, on August 15, he writes to John Adams, he says, I can conceive thought to be an action of a particular organization of matter formed for that purpose by its creator, by God, as well as that attraction is an action of matter, or magnetism of lodestone. When he who denies to the creator the power of endowing matter with the mode of action called thinking shall show how he could endow the sun with the mode of action called attraction, which reins the planets in the tracks of their orbits, or how an absence of matter can have a will, and by that will put matter into motion. Then the materialist may be lawfully required to explain the process by which matter exercises the faculty of thinking. When once we quit the basis of sensation, all is in the wind. To talk of immaterial existences is to talk of nothings. To say that the human soul, angels, God are immaterial is to say they are nothings, or that there is no God, no angels, no soul. I cannot reason otherwise. So Jefferson, this crucial letter to Adams shows he's an out and out materialist in the manner of Isaac Newton. And whatever we have to say on his belief of immortality of the soul, it has to accommodate materialism. There is no immaterial soul. Jefferson does not think that something immaterial, like if I move this pen, it's because my hand is in motion, my hand is attached to my body. It's entirely a material process, just like the working of the gears of the clock, things like that. So there are important letters that have a bearing on Jefferson's belief that there is no immortality of soul. The first of which is an early letter to his boyhood friend John Page, July 26, 1764. Jefferson talks about a man to Page who was submerged in water for, the best guess is, some 24 hours. He's presumed dead, and yet he was brought back to life, Jefferson says, by a method such as to give the vital warmth to the whole body by gentle degrees and to put the blood in motion by inflating the lungs, right? We are taught that when the bodily parts are completely cease to function, the soul, this immaterial thing, leaves the body. Jefferson sums, but does not this story contradict this opinion? So Jefferson, at least very young, is 64. He's 21 years old at the time. We have evidence that Jefferson is skeptical about there being a material soul that leaves the body upon death, right? Body can be revitalized. A thing that's thought dead can be revitalized. All right, so late in life letters, there are three of them that are very, very critical here. One is to John Adams in 1820. Jefferson refers to the works of Dugald Stewart, A.L.C., Destot de Tracy, and Pierre Jean-Georges Cabinet. And the argument is an analogical argument, and I follow it, give it as thus. He says, Jefferson argues that thought is to the organ of the brain as the magnetism is to the needle, or elasticity is to spring. a product, there of the matter organized in such a way. If I take the spring and destroy its material construction, I destroy its elasticity. It doesn't have any capacity to spring. Same thing with a magnet. If I sort of if I rearrange its matter or destroy its material composition in some such way, it no longer has the power of attraction. By implication, the notion is if I take a certain, the organ of thought, namely the brain, and Jefferson would have thought it was the brain, and destroy its material composition, I destroy thought. So thought is merely an activity of certain material composition, namely the human brain, the physical brain. When you rearrange the brain or destroy its physical composition, it's no longer capable of thought. He writes, on ignition of the needle or spring, their magnetism and elasticity cease. So on dissolution of the material organ by death, its action of thought may cease also, and nobody supposes that the magnetism or elasticity retire to hold a substantive and distinct existence. These were qualities only of particular conformations of matter. Change the conformation, and its qualities change also. So let's go back to this young man who died and he was declared dead because he was drowned in water for 24 hours. Why the person could be revivified, he could be revivified simply because the material organization of his brain wasn't materially or substantially damaged, right? So he could be brought back to life. He could be thought, his heart and other organs were not destroyed, right? But as he says, it's quite clear here. If you destroy at death, the material composition of the body is rearranged or destroyed such that the person cannot be brought back to life. Now, concerning the notion of can matter be so arranged that thought can occur? Now, this is a very strange thing. We tend to think of thought as some sort of immaterial process, and Jefferson at least wants to say whatever thought is, it's certainly dependent upon a material organ, namely the brain. Now, he talks about this being a mystery that the brain can have thought, but then again, it's a mystery that massive bodies like the sun and the earth have attractive capacities, inexplicable. Newton did not know what this force of gravity was. He thought it was a mystery, but it's a mystery, but it exists. Same thing with thought. Jefferson says, when I meet a proposition beyond finite comprehension, I abandon it as I do a weight which human strength cannot lift. And I think that's a sad thought. And I think ignorance in these cases is truly the softest pillow on which I can lay my head. Adds again, were it necessary, however, to form an opinion, I confess I should, with Mr. Locke, prefer swallowing one incomprehensibility rather than two. This is in keeping with Newton's principles of philosophy and his Principia Mathematica, that talks about the laws of gravity and laws of bodies. It's hard enough to understand how an organ like the brain can be given to thinking. It's a principle beyond my comprehension, but it's even harder to think how there could be something like an immaterial soul that acts on matter. That is even more incomprehensible. He says, matter endowed with thought is less incomprehensible than an existence called spirit, of which we have neither evidence nor idea. And then how that spirit, which has neither extension nor solidity, and he's following Locke here, can put material organs into motion. Okay, in 1825, he is talking about these experiments by Florenz and Cabinet on the brain, and he writes to John Adams and a friend, Francis Adrian Vanderkemp. Florenz and Cabinet have done experiments on the brains of vertebrates. And Jefferson writes to Adams of Florence's experiments, and he says, when you remove the cerebrum, the animal loses all its senses of hearing, seeing, feeling, smelling, tasting, is totally deprived of will, intelligence, memory, perception, though it retains the power of locomotion. So the cerebrum is the organ that is linked with all our sensations and thinking, but not locomotion. You remove the cerebellum. The animal retains its senses, its capacity to think and so forth, but has no capacity for locomotion. It Jefferson says it loses the power of regulated motion and exhibits all the symptoms of drunkenness. And he adds, puncture the medulla oblongata, instantaneous death. Now, this is complete physicalism. Jefferson writes, I wish to see what the spiritualists will say to this. Sounds just like his early letter to Page. Whether in this state the soul remains in the body, deprived of its essence of thought, or whether it leaves as in death and where it goes, right? So if the soul is something that leaves the body, and then at some point, if a person is revivified, it comes back into the body. Well, what happens in this case? Where does this intellective soul, Descartes calls it, rational soul, where does this go? What happens when these physical experiments are performed? What happens to the soul? Jefferson just saying, look, the soul just is matter. It's a property of certain types of matter. Okay, he writes to Francis Adrian van der Kemp, talks of the experiments. He says, the cerebrum is the organ of thought and possesses alone the faculty of thinking, right? And then he adds, well, what happens to the soul upon death? Where does it go? Okay, now that's pretty substantial evidence. And to me, and any rational person, I think sufficient enough to show that Jefferson thinks that the soul is just a property of, is an accident of certain types of material composition and certain types of organisms. But there's additional evidence that Jefferson doesn't think. So in other words, if you destroy the matter, you destroy thinking, and there is no soul, as it were. There is a mind, and that mind is, linked with the brain. In The Life and Morals of Jesus, which he writes and composes in 1819 and 1820. Are you dying there, dog? That's a dog sitting here. Jefferson gives us a sort of humanized Jesus. Jesus does not perform miracles. Jesus is not the Son of God, and Jesus does not go to an afterlife. Now, if Jefferson really believed in an afterlife, as did Priestley and Rush, to Joseph Priestley and Benjamin Rush, he certainly would have included in that book the account of Jesus ascending into heaven at the end of the Gospels, right? He doesn't, and that's another reason to think that that he doesn't believe in an afterlife. When his wife died, he and his wife copy a passage from Tristram Shandy, from Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, his favorite book. And there is, the passage goes something like, Jefferson copies on the sheet of paper, and every time I kiss thy hand to bid adieu, every absence which follows it are preludes to that eternal separation we are shortly to make. Now, the first half is written by Jefferson's wife, right? And then Jefferson writes the other half, so they're sharing this passage. It's a very intimate and beautiful and moving moment. And it's a passage that talks about eternal separation. If Jefferson really believed in an afterlife, he would not copy this passage. He would have copied an optimistic passage about meeting his wife. This is a letter to a most intimate person, one whom he loved as much as he loved himself. And he would have had a passage about meeting in the afterlife. He does not. And I can merely add, following a friend of mine, Arthur Scher, that the extent and the length of Jefferson's grieving upon the passing of his wife is further evidence of there being no afterlife. He's not going to meet her. He's grieving really bitterly because he's lost her forever. So I hope you like this piece here. It is, I talk about this issue in American Messiah, my book. And it's very, if you want a copy of this, I can send you a copy for $35, autograph it, and mail it to you. It is, I think, my best book on Thomas Jefferson insofar I've written on Jefferson religion more than anybody else. And I think it's my best book, and I've said this before, simply because the assertions I make here, I clear up a lot of the confusion about Jefferson and religion. And the assertions I make here, I think, will stand the test of time. I really think that this book is relatively foolproof in terms of the conclusions I draw from Jefferson's thoughts on religion and morality. And it's a really good book, and I think you'd like that. So I hope you enjoyed this, and please, if you do, like and share. And TTFN, for now. Jefferson and I are signing off.